that when there was an uprising in Czechoslovakia in the August of 1968, and the Czech socialists and communists said, we want our social system, we like it, but we also want democracy. The phrase popularized by the leader of that period, Alexander Dubček, as socialism with a human face, which became very popular. And you had things happening in that country at the time which were unthinkable then and leave alone now. That the media was taken over by the people who worked for it. And I remember one television show that was so striking and which did so much to raise the political consciousness of that country and neighboring countries that the Russians got scared. This was a show where all those who had been political prisoners since the Second World War confronted their jailers, their warders, and the people who had ordered their arrests. And the entire country would watch this show. Now, that degree of freedom, if you like, one had not noticed anywhere. And the combination of increasing control of the media by the population, because that's what it was. You had big debates in the press, far beyond anything in the Western press, frightened the Russians because they said, if this example spreads, we are sunk. And so they sent in the tanks to destroy and occupy Czechoslovakia, as some of you will remember. But the interesting point I was going to make was that this particular occupation and crushing of a popular movement did not excite too much anger in the West. If you compare it to other things, of course, criticisms were made, but they were so mild that one wondered whether secretly they were quite pleased, because the experiment threatened them as well. And the NATO magazine, which had a long article on Czechoslovakia, only remarked on the speed with which Soviet troops had taken Prague. They were very admiring, militarily. But behind that military admiration must have been a very deep ambiguity. And that ambiguity has always been very strong and remains strong to this day. And so the ideology which was developed after the Cold War was no longer the ideology of freedom and democracy, but it was the ideology of universal human rights as interpreted by the West and as interpreted by those whom it funded in large parts of the world, who were called, in the early days and still are, NGOs or non-governmental organizations. People were nervous in different parts of the world when the NGOs started. Some of them did good work, some were more propagandistic, some were simply a new way for the West to buy off the intelligentsia of large parts of the world. This had been done during the Cold War. The CIA had set up the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Lots of intellectuals globally had been bought up. Magazines like Encounter magazine had been started. The new project, the lineage, was the Congress of Cultural Freedom, but this was a different world. This was given a civil society coloration, and one was told that NGOs plus neoliberalism equaled modern democracy. And that's all you were going to get, which completely restricted the functioning of democracy and accountability. Of course, the NGOs are now referred in many parts of the world as WGOs, Western governmental organizations, after the countries that fund them, and are increasingly beginning to be seen as such, as people who basically, some of them might do good work, but by and large become a barrier to achieving any real social change in those countries. And this combination of so-called civil society groups, i.e. NGOs, and neoliberalism was soon to be pushed militarily And the first country where they decided to do this was the former Yugoslavia. Now, that particular war was accepted by people largely in the West. It was accepted as a war which was stopping horrible things being done, because the images were very fresh in people's minds. The images that were conjured up in order to push through this agenda were images of the Holocaust, which quite honestly was a disgrace that that was done, because it was nothing like it, and not even remotely like it. This was a pretty dirty, unpleasant civil war which broke up the former Yugoslavia. For what reason? That the structural adjustment program demanded by the World Bank and the IMF wrecked that country. For one whole year, they couldn't pay the Yugoslav army. They didn't receive their salaries. And a very good researcher at the Brookings Institute, Susan Woodward, wrote a very powerful book actually mapping out how Yugoslavia was made ungovernable by the economic policies it was forced to pursue. And when you do this, then people become more and more conscious of their own identity to defend themselves or to gain whatever's on offer. And that created the circumstances of an unpleasant civil war. But to blame one side for that civil war, the Serbs, when the Croats behaved just as abominably, the Bosnians were least to blame, it has to be said, but the Serbs and Croats, there was very little to differentiate between these two sides, but because the Croats were backing the West, so the Serbs were totally demonized. And the result, if you go to Yugoslavia today, is horrific. Absolutely, no one talks about it now, because that's the world we live in. A world of short-term memories. You can use the media, you can use ideological constructs to whip up popular frenzy, go to war, and then no one cares. Because you think it's over. But it isn't over. The war is over. But the conditions created by the war and the breakup of that country are still there. The decline in the social rights of all the former constituents of Yugoslavia, the figures are completely shocking, if you were to read them. What they've lost and what cannot be regained under the present structure. And the tragedy of that is that it was perfectly possible. Here the European Union is more to blame initially than anything the United States did. The European Union, seeing what was going on, could have made a massive offer to the Yugoslav states, saying, here's $1 billion or 2 billion euros as untied, unconditional aid, and we are prepared to give this to you provided you maintain a confederal structure of your country and don't allow it to collapse, and we will make sure the money is well spent on social infrastructural projects. Wasn't done. And then the war cost billions and billions and billions. So everyone is prepared to spend on war, but no one is prepared to spend anything on peace. And there's a lot of talk about the Marshall Plan that followed the Second World War as a model plan. Well, you know, one has to understand what the Marshall Plan was. It was a plan to recover Western Europe because of the communist enemy. Very important to understand that. The reason the United States, which had emerged as the strongest power after the Second World War, its industries were booming, they'd done well out of the war from that point of view as far as the US industry and economy was concerned, the choice they faced was a horrific choice for them. What do you do with the broken up, your former enemies and your allies? Western Europe was in ruins, Japan had been nuked, Germany was totally desolate and desperate. What do you do? If you don't do anything, you could have a social revolution in all these countries and the commies would get them. So you pour in money. And they did it. It's the only time in history that a power has resuscitated its economic rivals in order to strengthen them against a common enemy. It's never happened before, and I predict it's unlikely to happen again.